There we go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second Audi talk of 2022. I'm wondering if we're going to start going back to having what did we call them? Audi cafes. It's been so long. It's been 25 months since we've had a face-to-face Audi cafe at our offices in Woodmead, and I miss it. And this morning when Beatrice went, "Hello, Eugene," I was just imagining that happening in person over the nice smell of coffee and breakfast being served and just people being together. But the nice thing with having the online sessions is we can have speakers and guests from all over the globe. And Deon is in Cape Town, so he wouldn't have been able to be our guest this morning if we were to have a face-to-face session. So welcome, and as you know, some of you have attended a lot of our Audi cafes back at the office, Audi talks since the pandemic. And you know, we like to listen around and any topics that we hear that our clients and people in our community are talking about, to bring that into the Audi talk sessions and to just play with those topics a bit, and to try and invite people who's might be experts or research experts in the area to come and talk to us and share a little bit more. So I met Deon years ago. Deon, 2017, 18,
2014. I was with Mutual and Federal, 2014.
2014, when we trained some of Deon's HR staff in our Audi. I think the Mutual and Federal people did the full Audi certificate, the higher certificate. And then there was HR business partnering Audi training for some of your people up in Africa when you were with Old Mutual.
Yeah, that's correct.
And last year, or sometime in the pandemic, I saw that Deon started this new organization called Africa People Advisory Group, and I was very excited to see what this is. And they then published a research study that they did, and I attended the presentation. It was June, I think, last year, Deon.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And I was saying to Deon earlier, I was so excited because everything they presented just spoke to me. It's the work that Wolseley has been doing, some of the modules that's built into our higher certificate, some of the courses like HR business partnering that we do, our new employee engagement and experience certificate. I took about 6 pages of notes, and I was just sharing with everybody that wanted to listen how excited I was that all the new HR trends are stuff that we've been talking about it and developing courses and content and teaching and training on those topics for the past few years. And we've been working with Deon and Oliver and the team of Africa People Advisory Group for a while now. Combining our efforts and skills and expertise and content into a strategic business partnering training course that we actually currently still in the middle of delivering. So I thought to invite Deon to come and share with us all these new trends in HR that I got so excited about last year, and that's still continuing. And for us as an Audi community to maybe think about that. HR and Audi in South Africa is quite often so blurred anyway. If I think about the people that has been our students on the higher certificate in Audi and Change, I don't think even 10% of them had Audi in their title. They were mostly HR people, L&D, who wanted to start specializing more in Audi or just wanted to understand Audi more. Or they were an HR person who's now gotten the Audi role in the HR department or whatever it is. So I think there's a very beautiful connection between the two, and the new trends are, for me, making the lines a little bit more blurry compared to what we would have seen, for example, 5 years ago. So I'm going to hand over to Deon, and Deon, you, if you don't mind introducing yourself and just saying a little bit more. I think we've mentioned some of where you come from. And then Deon is going to take us through the trends and the research that they've done. And after that, we'll have some conversations like we normally do and explore the topic further. So thank you, Deon. Over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Liesl. So just by means of quick introduction, As Liesla said, my name's Deon de Swart, and I'm one of the managing partners and founding partners of a company called Africa People Advisory Group. So ironically, in our company, I'm the only HR person. So the other partners, the one has a degree in law and finance, and the other one is in statistics and economics. Oliver's got an MBA. We've got a person with a master's in economics in Zimbabwe. And our lie, Sanet, who just joined us from Corn Ferry, I think also has a background in HR. But kind of as we started this HR company, I was the only HR person. And I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but it's worked out relatively okay for us. So we've been in existence for about 2.5 years now. So I think we're still very much in startup phase. And what makes us a little bit different from the rest is that we are very strongly focused on the rest of Africa. We really work in South Africa opportunistically. So I live in Cape Town, my partners live in Joburg. We've got one employee in Zimbabwe, and we've just appointed somebody in Nigeria, an Afrikaans speaking lady in Nigeria. And then we've got a South African based company with 3 ex-EOH consultants that focus more in the South African market. But our passion on our side of the business really lies in the rest of Africa.
It looks like Deon's frozen. His voice was still coming through. Deon?
And so, we couldn't get it right then. And we said, look, we've got to do this ourselves. We've got to produce something that is relevant for Africa. So we've got a whole bunch of participation from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Zim, from Ethiopia, all over. And that's really the piece that excited us. So I must say, I've never been referred to as a research specialist. I remember I think I cummed my research studies in my undergrad, but I can tell you, I did not understand a single thing. It was literally all just parrot style in those years. So I wouldn't call myself a research specialist, but we are quite excited about the study, and we are actually going to be rerunning it for the second time now, and we'll be bringing in a couple of new concepts. So we do want to find out if the Great Resignation is at all prevalent in the rest of Africa. We want to deep dive a little bit more into employee experience, because that's really the piece that excites me more than anything else, is the employee experience piece. So I'm going to share a very, very abbreviated version of the presentation today. There is a full report. So if you are interested in the full report, it's about a 30-page report. You're most welcome to reach out to me, and I can refer you just to go and download the report. So I'll really share kind of just the main topics and themes with you today. Just confirming that everybody can see my screen. Perfect, right?
Yeah.
So let me get started. So the way that we've kind of termed the study is, if you pull the themes together, which really are human capital kind of themes, we focused on building an employee-centric value proposition that enable new ways of working. And so whilst we were running the study in the midst of COVID, we didn't want the focus to only be COVID. We wanted to stretch it a little bit wider, and we wanted to focus on 2 things. The one is organizational responses to COVID, which at that point in time was relatively new. But at the same time, we didn't want to forget about the fact that we're still in the 4th industrial revolution, and technology was still playing a pretty big impact. So our study wanted to combine the kind of interpretation or the trends that organizations were following, both in relation to COVID and remote working, but also still thinking about, well, what about technology and the impact that has on organizations currently. We then went a little bit further. So on the left-hand side is the study, and you can see there's some partner companies we worked with across Africa to kind of get it out and participation up. But we also ran an HR metrics benchmark survey last year, around about the same time. And what we did here is, we often found in working for previous companies that getting benchmark data on things like, cost per employee, profit per employee, number of training days, turnover rates, was just not available. Or you could go to a certain company that produces it in South Africa at really, really high rates. So we then started a benchmark survey, which had really good traction. But to be very honest, we haven't been able to get companies to re-participate. So Part of what I'll share is also some feedback from our benchmark study across Africa on some key metrics. So in the new ways of working study, we had about 152 individual participants representing 134 companies from 14 countries and 21 industries. So what we did here is we said, look, if you work for Britam Insurance and you submit in 2 or 3 countries, we kind of counted those as individual ones. So it's not a massive study, but it's certainly, I think, more than what we expected to get the first time around as a new company. And then if you look at the HR metrics study, we had about 30 group companies across 43 countries in Africa with about 130 individual companies. So EcoBank submitted in multiple countries as an example, and those stretched across 9 industries. So, quite a substantial study as far as the benchmark data is concerned. And we identified 6 key themes from the study. And what I've done for today is I've really just extracted 1 or 2 slides on each of these. So I'll spend a bit more time on it, but to quickly just cover the main ones. So what we have found in the conversation with companies and the research is that the view about the future definitely is around hybrid working. And I mean, I do currently a fair amount of travel across Africa, and I'm kind of almost saddened to see how many companies are just forcing people back to work. Not on a hybrid model, but almost everybody has to return. And so, this research tells us that the intent is to create hybrid working models where people will have a mix of working from an office, working from home, or at least having a level of choice. But I think one of the key things that we discovered is that we definitely need a new set of leadership skills and competencies. So as we go through the leadership competencies, you'll identify 1 or 2 of the old ones, and there's 1 or 2 new ones that we feel are quite important to focus on. So definitely a different way of leading in a hybrid world. The second item, which focuses more on technology in the 4th industrial revolution, is that from the participants, we've seen a pretty low take-up of org restructure as a result of technology and the impacts of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so we were quite surprised if you consider what is happening in South Africa and elsewhere. Companies seem loath to react to the need to change as a result of technology, and the take-up around structure change is quite low. But the one thing that we wanted to add in here is that what we have seen is just a very massive change in the way that learning is delivered. And I mean, I guess this is a little bit outdated because this is the way that we work now. I was in Kenya last week delivering a job evaluation project, and it is the first time on Saturday that we delivered a face-to-face workshop, and it was on developing job descriptions. But I saw again that there is just no replacement for the face-to-face stuff. The way that you can engage, read the audience, read the dynamics is just so exceptionally difficult to do when you don't meet with people face-to-face. So I was kind of quite excited and also a little bit exhausted at the end of the day. Then employee wellness is very much center stage. And what we have seen is that the risk of burnout is at the highest point, it's been in many years. So we got some input from an ex-colleague of mine, Dr. Mark Orpen-Lyle, that really specializes in resilience as part of the input to the study as well. I think one of the key things for me is that if we as the HR function want to continue to add strategic value, we definitely need to be building a new set of skills. And so I'll talk a little bit later about the kind of skills that we feel are important, but the skills that we've had in the past won't necessarily be the skills that will make us successful into the future. So, we've identified 2 or 3 skills that we feel are quite critical for the HR profession to pick up. Then I would say a little bit on the disappointing side is that we haven't seen people and HR practices keep track with developments globally. And here I want to specifically stand still on employee experience. As much as we've seen this evolution of employee engagement into EX, even some of the large South African companies that we work with has not yet made that switch to start looking at EX. And so I'll talk a little bit about our view on practices and where organizations are at. And then largely, and I always say that I'm quite sad about this one, that diversity and inclusion is still far from where we need it to be. And so we really believe that from a trend perspective, we need to start getting the right conversation at executive and at board level. And I would say, as much as HR is the facilitator of some of this process. I really don't believe that HR should be the face and own the outcome of D&I. And where we've seen it work, we've had senior leaders stand up and take accountability and move it beyond the numbers. Because if we're simply trying to achieve the numbers, we're getting the diversity, but not the inclusion aspect right. So those are the 6 trends. As I mentioned, what I'll do is I'll spend a little bit of time on each of those just to delve into a little bit more perspective. So if we look at the first one on the left-hand side, what we've seen is that when we started the survey around about a year ago, and we asked companies, prior to COVID, where were you at as far as remote working is concerned? Only 31% of companies had some kind of remote working policy in place. And in the midst of COVID, when we did the survey, that then increased to 67. And when we asked companies, well, kind of what's the future state, about 90% of companies said that we are either busy approving or in the process of implementing some kind of remote working policy. And it'll be interesting, we're going to ask this question again this year to see if there's been any further movement and whether the intent to move that way has still happened and what formation that will take. And at the bottom left, we kind of give you an indication from our metrics survey just on some of the elements of costs. So if we look at revenue per employee, and we had about 90 companies that represented that, we found a kind of a 50th percentile point at $84,000 revenue per employee. So what we're saying is that if you look at the opportunity that remote working and flexible working represents, it's not only about the employee value proposition and the ability to offer something that many employees want, but there's also an opportunity to save real money for the organization. So, if you think about companies not needing the kind of office space they needed to, the infrastructure that goes with it, if we think about the ability to deliver more in a time where I don't need to travel to work and so forth, there's a real EVP benefit, but also real cost impact at the end of the day. So if we look at the next item, which is really about the structural elements and to what extent organizations have responded in a positive or a negative way to the fourth industrial revolution, then what is interesting for us to find is that only 23% of companies have said that as a result of technology and 4IR, we've started with some form of reorganization. Now, we do a lot of work as far as job evaluation is concerned across the continent. And we are now in our second year only starting to pick up org design work. So it's a relatively slow adaptation to the need to change structures and change organizations as a result of the introduction of technology. And so we were quite surprised by that. However, there was a report published by the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago where they spoke about what are some of the key skills that we require into the future. And when you look at where companies are recruiting, they are recruiting in those kind of skills that we expect will be in high demand. So, technical skills specific to the industry, leadership and management, sales and marketing, and then data science and data analytics. We've seen quite a big increase as far as the recruitment of employees are concerned. So, we say it's a bit of a dichotomy because you wouldn't expect recruitment happening in the space where you aren't necessarily building the skills and the structures. So just to quickly cover the conversation around employee wellness, we've seen 67% or 61% of organizations prior to COVID had some kind of wellness strategy in place. And once again, keeping in mind that if we were to purely look at a South African perspective, I probably would have expected the numbers to be higher. But when we look across the continent, there are many companies that still don't have a formalized approach to EWP. And 67% of companies said that we actually adjusted our employee wellness strategies during COVID. And there's a couple of examples of what companies have done. So of course, the one is more flexibility, the introduction of things like shift work, access to doctors, nurses, and so forth. And then a lot of online activity, sensitization articles and so forth. So that's in relation to the response to burnout and EWP. And then I think if we just focus on burnout separately, what we've seen is that about 62% of companies observed an increase in the levels of burnout, while 58% of companies provided some kind of training for managers to at least identify and refer or to work with the symptoms that sit around the potential for burnout of employees in organizations. And I mean, I think if you look at some of the news articles coming out during lockdown, just the increase in domestic violence has been a big issue in South Africa alone. When we start looking at, the kind of skills that we think are important for human resources professionals, we've identified 5 skills that stand out. And we have a whole separate webinar around human capital competencies for the future. And we've kind of cross-referenced a number of studies, and the same message keeps on coming out. So we've seen a very high level of consistency with what we found and what we found in Gartner studies and in Mercer studies. And there's a company called HR Future that does a lot of work in metrics and analytics and so forth, a gentleman with the name of David Breen, and a very high level of consistency. So the number one skill that comes out is people analytics. So the ability to solve business problems using people data comes through as a very, very strong theme. And we actually do quite a bit of work with companies across the continent and in South Africa, building some of these skills just at a foundational level. Problem solving. So I would say that problem solving probably goes with strategic consulting skills. So we've got a client that we're working with, Worldsview, currently. And when we started scoping the project, they said to us that we are implementing a new HRIS. And what we expect to happen is that a lot of the administrative work is going to disappear, and our HR business partners don't have the skills to consult strategically. And so we're seeing a big trend as far as strategic consulting skills, and with that, problem solving. Of course, good old business acumen, I mean, it's been there for many years, but it continues to come up. And the one that surprised me was strategic workforce planning skills, because I do think it's a skill that most, and I'm generalizing, that most HR professionals don't have. And it's, I think, a relatively complex project and initiative to introduce, but there definitely is a call to say, we think there's a need to specifically focus on what are the scarce skills, what is the supply, what is the demand, and what is the plan for developing some of those. There's a slide here that I haven't included that also talks about the new roles for HR. So outside of the skills, we've identified a couple of roles, and the 3 roles that we've identified is kind of the champion as far as culture is concerned. So how do we enable the right kind of culture? How do we create awareness around the kind of culture that we require in the organization? And how do we drive leadership to create that kind of culture? Linked to that, the second one is the custodian of leadership skills. So how do we enable the business to identify and develop a new set of leadership skills? And the last one is your employee wellness champion. So how do we really champion the cause around employee wellness, reducing anxiety and stress and reducing burnout? So I thought I'll just quickly mention those 3 that are more new roles as opposed to new skills that are required in kind of what we refer to as new ways of working. Then I want to stand still a little bit and just talk about employee engagement to employee experience. So, we do a fair amount of work in the space of employee engagement. We've got a tool that we've developed specifically for Africa that is quite standardized and low cost, that we deploy, at least 1 or 2 a month. But we also acknowledge that working on employee engagement is just not enough anymore. We really need to make the switch to EX. So in our study, we found, just a couple of numbers on the left, about 62% of companies said we've got some kind of engagement survey in place. And we've got about 58% say that we measure this formally. But when we ask them about employee experience, only 27% of HR functions have formally adopted EX. And as I've said, we've addressed and spoken to a couple of really, really large organizations in South Africa. I'm talking about the companies with 20, 30, 40,000 people. And the ones that we've engaged have not yet started the journey around employee experience. And so only 27% of companies have formally adopted the principles, and 29% of companies have formally allocated the accountability to some senior person in HR to say, you need to start a journey with us. And so for me, this is probably one of the biggest gaps, but also one of the biggest opportunities that we will have in terms of impacting employees in organizations, the culture in organizations, simplification of processes in organizations. And usually when we talk about EX, we also start bringing in the whole concept of beyond generational theory to start talking about employee personas, and how do you actually create personas for the organization where you have flexibility in not having one EVP, but multiple EVPs that fit a specific persona. So I think there's some, interesting conversations just in the space of employee personas. And then as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned, for us, 41% of companies said that they've got some kind of D&I strategy in place. 13% only are looking to introduce a strategy, and 38% said that they measure D&I in performance contracts. And so for us, the issue around D&I is probably a lot more fundamental. And I've kind of, one of the comments was that when we look at a continent with so much promise, we really should be setting the bar a lot higher as far as D&I is concerned. And I mean, Roy Gluckman, which is one of the thought leaders in D&I in South Africa, met him a couple of years ago. He kind of has this comment that says, diversity without inclusion is not enough. Having great representation of race and age and language and all that kind of stuff, if you have the representation, but you still have groupings of people that don't feel included in the organization, you've really missed the mark. You might get the numbers right, but it doesn't transpose into real transformation and lasting impact. So the last slide on my side is, we kind of end the full presentation, which is about 60 slides or so, with a couple of takeouts and a call for action to organizations. And we really say three things. If you really want to impact your organization as far as new ways of working is concerned, the first one is to formally adopt EX. Start somewhere. There is so much content available on the internet around EX. We work quite closely with Josh Person, who is considered to be one of the global thought leaders in HR currently. And he recently co-produced actually a sponsored project by Microsoft to start looking at what is EX all about. And they've developed a model where they refer to the irresistible organization. And that really resonated with me. It's a kind of organization that you get so excited to work at. So they built a really nice model around, how do you establish EX and where do you get started? So for us, the starting point is to adopt and embrace the principles of EX. The second item around that is to have a very clear plan around the kind of skills that you want to develop for your HR function. So as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time currently developing metrics and analytics skills and developing strategic HR business partnering skills, but there probably are a set of skills in between that might be unique to an organization that they also need to focus on. And I think the third element of this is, as much as we want to have EX, we want to have the right kind of HR skills, it is also still embedded or, I guess reinforced by the right kind of leadership. And as much as there are generic models and generic competencies, I think one must also understand your own organization and say, what are some of the leadership skills that are unique to our organization that we need to build, and to have a plan, identify the competencies and make sure that there's a plan to develop the competencies. So that's a very short overview of the study. I really just wanted to share the highlights with you. As I said, there's a lot of content available, so feel free to reach out to myself or to Liesel, and I'll be happy to send a link where you can go and download the full report. Thank you so much. Happy to take any questions or comments if there are any.
Yeah, I think, let's see, are there any questions or comments to Deon before we go into breakaways to just chat about what it is we've heard and what's come up for you? Anyone? Not yet. Okay, so I'm going to start the breakaway rooms, and it's really just to go and have a conversation about what did you hear, and was there any, oh my goodness, look at that, and I can't believe this, or this is great news, or whatever came up for you. Have that conversation, and then we'll bring that back to the bigger room, and we'll see where the conversation takes us next. Nikki? So let's hear what you discussed in your rooms. What came up for you? There was a room where, Beverly, I know you joined late. Christo, Danielle joined sort of halfway through, Janine, Karina, and Nikki. What did you guys talk about?
I'll jump in and say quickly two things that we talked about. We talked about the really big need for people analytic skills in HR. Karina mentioned that she's seeing it everywhere. And it's, I guess that's one part of it's the development of HR, and the other part of it is who are HR going to employ? Because there may not be always just HR principally. And then the other big conversation, really big conversation, is the question of HR's mandate and HR's lack of mandate. And the horrible thing that after saying this for 2 decades, HR still doesn't have a place at the table. And I'm like, well, Danielle mentioned, the thing of when there's a choice between productivity and people, the organization chooses productivity. But, there's like so many studies. Do we still have to say that people, productivity? Is it a matter that executives just doesn't believe it? What's the problem here? I mean, why doesn't HR have a place at the table? I personally don't get it. And I don't think the problem is only with HR.
Well, I guess
with a business philosophy.
Well, finance doesn't have that problem, right? They are just immediately accepted. So, I mean, I'm often shocked that I mentioned early on, we run a relatively cost-effective engagement survey across Africa. Typical cost company less than 500 people is around $4,000. You cannot believe how many heads of HR in the companies that we work with have to go to the board, not even to the CEO, to the board, to get approval for a $4,000 survey to understand how their people are feeling. I mean, if I look at the kind of companies we work with, I can count on my one hand the HR directors that can make a $10,000 or $100,000 decision. I'm absolutely shocked, and I often also talk about the fact when I was with Old Mutual, I kind of walked into a new position as the head of HR for Africa, and the head of strategy said to me, "You've got a 2 million rand budget this year," and I'm like, what the hell am I going to do with 2 million rand? I've never had any money to spend, but the business will easily invest 50, 60, 70 million in a new IT platform. So I think there's also a part where we don't claim our seat. So I remember working with a particularly tough client in Old Mutual. She's now the COO. And I walked into her office one day, and excuse the language, she said to me, "Piss off." And I said, "Eloise, what?" She said, "No, leave. I don't have time for you." I said to her, "I'm not leaving until you speak to me." And so we built a really good relationship. And when I left that role, I said to her, "The one thing that you've built in me is the skill of resilience." And I think, sometimes we're just not pushing hard enough. We don't understand the business well enough. And I think that's where some of the metric stuff comes in, because what we report on currently is we go to an exco meeting and we talk about the amount of HR people to business people. Who cares? You've got to reflect, what is the cost per employee, the profit per employee, what are the turnover rates, what are the key roles? And so I think sometimes we also don't do ourselves a favor in having the right conversations. And you've got to start to build the credibility, and then you can bring in some of the other concepts. But yeah, I think sometimes we need to also take accountability ourselves that we're not employing the right people in the HR functions to really stand up and say, well, I'm actually going to claim the seat whether you want it or not, and then build the credibility. So just a bit of a different view from me.
Interesting view. I like it. And I like that you said, don't understand the business well enough, because that's, again, coming from that business acumen point of view of do you understand the language? I think, Deon, you said in one of our classes last week or the week before, you were saying, are you attending the right meetings? And maybe it is a matter of walking in and saying, I'm now attending.
No, maybe a little bit of flippant note. That's one area where analytics is really cool, because it gives you numbers. And the people running organizations, they love numbers. You talk numbers with them.
Yeah, and I always say this,
They
when
sure
I
do.
step into a new HR role, there's two relationships that are key for me. The PA to the MD, so that I know I can get time, and then the chief financial officer, because I know I'm terrible with numbers and I will need help in calculating stuff and I will need access to money. So those two relationships are critical for me when I step into a new senior position.
Yeah.
I think for me, from what I've experienced, I think for any people-based intervention, that's going to cost money. It's to be able to build a business case for that and demonstrate what the possible ROI is for that. Some of the things that we deal with, it's very difficult to actually measure the ROI, but I think we still need to put in an effort to build a really convincing business case to get sign off on that, particularly if it's out of budget. But even if it's within budget, it's still an important thing to do. And that's, for me, one of the ways where we can get a seat at the table a little bit more effectively.
And if you think about ROI and it becomes scary because of numbers, there's always there's always something to measure, I think. For example, if we say build the case for EX, we can tie EX to productivity, absenteeism, employee retention, etc. And there are numbers for that. We just have to literally think through. So what if we move something here, what else is moving on the other side? And then like Deon says, have the contact who can help you with those numbers, help you to find those numbers. Look for the metrics that's already there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm listening to all of the comments around here, and I think one of the critical things that doesn't happen in organizations is executives aren't measured in terms of people development, people improvement, engagement levels, organizational health. They're only measured on organizational efficiency and effectiveness. So they're measured on the hard productivity numbers. And as long as that is in place, you can't really shift organizations meaningfully because organizations set up the wrong metrics for success around that. In our group, we spoke about the notion of creating social safety. And I said that I don't use the word psychological because companies pull back from that. But if you set up meaningful social safety where people are treated like you want to be treated throughout the organization, it starts shifting the paradigm. And one of the clients who I've been working extensively around creating social safety in the last while, the CEO sat with me a little while ago and remarked, saying that his people don't know how to react to him now. Now that he's created a socially safe environment, they actually sit with a mouthful of teeth and they don't know how to react. So when I explored this with him, I said to him, so when you actually got irate and irritated and raised your voice in meetings, what did people do? He said they became apologetic. So I said, okay, so you've created a parent-child type of relationship. I get pissed off, excuse the French. You become apologetic, and then we're able to move on from that. But then it takes away the responsibility of the executive to actually shift the organization. So as soon as the CEO now started creating this notion of a parent socially safe environment, people are unsure as to how to act as executives. And the metric in terms of what they measured on is busy shifting. So now they are becoming responsible in this organization for creating a socially safe environment on a mandate from the CEO. And it's a massive culture change and it creates pain in the organization. So I think a lot of what we're barking up against is this whole notion of just incorrect measures in the organization. And it's just a different perspective.
Mm.
I think just to come in there, it's very interesting, the sort of stuff that you're involved in, Eugene, and the discussion we had in our group around bias, because I raised the issue of what's going on with diversity and inclusion being the key term, because everybody's kind of grappling with what this means. And Eugene was talking about some deep work he's been doing around the issue of bias and tackling unconscious bias in an organization. And I think even if you come back to people analytics, and maybe sometimes HR people are just not adept at making the right connections. So HR people who decry poor management or poor leadership in their organizations and say that there's a tolerance of this at the top because the poor leadership or the poor management still gets results in terms of bottom line or reaching sales targets or whatever the case is. And some of the coaching I've done in that space with HR people is, so if you're frustrated about the level of tolerance that's being displayed towards poor leadership and poor management and what that means in terms of staff turnover, why don't you start building some solid cases around, here's what your poor leadership is costing you guys, and actually start building some solid metrics around all of this in terms of, you know, what are we looking at? We're looking at this, we're looking at resignation, we're looking at loss of skill. How long has it taken us to replace skill? What have we forked out in terms of, you know, recruiting and selecting for those skills, for example? What has it meant in terms of productivity? Because often there is a loss of productivity in a fairly, you know, unhappy area, which goes back to employee experience. So what some of the coaching that I do with HR people is to say, you've got to start connecting the dots more clearly for people. And if you manage some of what you're frustrated about with some hard metrics, you know, you have that kind of business case that I forget the name of the individual who was talking about build a business case earlier. Oliver was talking about, you know, build some kind of a business case. Yeah, so I think there's that very deep skill deficit in the HR fraternity. They'll be very adept at talking about poor leadership and management skills, but they won't be able to tie it back to metrics.
Yeah, Beatrice, for me, the one word that you used describes the tolerance of poor leadership, poor practices, poor inclusivity in organizations, and that is the word unconscious. Because people just don't focus on it. It's an unconscious process, and if you don't create deliberate conscious awareness around some of the aspects, nothing changes.
So it's interesting. I was a number of years ago in a permanent position. I was involved in kind of a bit of an investigation in Zimbabwe for one of the senior leaders who was actually the head of audit, one of the large organizations. Myself and a colleague went in, and there was allegations that this guy was just not leading in the right way. So we spent a week there engaging. And the outcome of this process is that the senior leader, the head of audit, was dismissed with a letter to the whole business saying he's been fired for poor leadership. And, you know, usually you kind of get these letters to say they're pursuing personal interests, and they were straight up. The guy was a useless leader. He treated people badly. He was a dictator. And it's like one of the things that stood out for me. I know you could, you know, probably say whether it was legal, but it took some real courage. And when I think about the leaders that I worked with there at CEO level, it's also probably some of the most inspiring leaders, authentic leaders I've ever seen. So for me, that was like very directly dealing with issues of culture and bullying. I remember my first LinkedIn article I wrote about 1.5 years ago, and I kind of sat on this thing for months, was about my own experiences being bullied. And the reaction that I got when I posted it on LinkedIn was so overwhelming, because so many people are facing this. And so it ties back to that, you know, the social, psychological safety and how we build a culture that enables it. And yeah, often when people say you can speak up, they often don't really mean it. And unfortunately, you learn the hard way, like me.
Anything else from the room that you guys were in? Deon, Eugene, Beatrice. Who else was in there? Jenny. I think we covered everything.
Yeah, I think we covered everything. Thanks, Liesel.
So what I'm thinking is, what does this mean for OD? Just the seat at the table, but on the other hand, when Deon was talking earlier about the new roles that is part of the new ways of working, and he mentioned that there's a role of custodian of leadership skills and culture, and how important consulting skills is.
Yeah.
What does that mean for OD? Because wasn't that OD's work? Culture and leadership and
can I make it?
Business acumen and stuff. Yes, Nikki.
And look, with due respect to anybody's intelligence, I still think we need to actually explain what the acronym means, and then the actual the explanation of the acronym: organizational development. Leaders, some leaders in management, and with due respect to them, they still don't even understand the terminology. Point blank.
No,
So I
sure.
think that's, I know, I mean, and we're the converted, so I do appreciate that. So we need to move on from that. But what does it mean for OD? I've just shared just a couple of words. I've shared some references to some researchers. The article, and I'm happy to share it with the community, by Elizabeth Klaus, just talks to the capabilities and the type of resources and the resourcefulness that is needed in HR to enable the shift in organizations. Actually is a very useful piece of ammunition, almost, to a reference to actually then unpack a case study from there as about actually getting in specialists like us. So there's huge, humongous, unprecedented opportunity for people who are educated, knowledgeable, and skilled and experienced, multiple discipline experience, particularly with psychology, to actually advise and facilitate HR to transform. And I really honestly just cry at the tragedy of corporate HR being completely disintegrated or completely obliterated. I've just seen it, witnessed in an organization where the entire corporate HR has been terminated because they feel that they are not actually capable of actually evolving, and they feel they're not necessary. It's horrendous. It's like 40 people, 50 people that have been affected, and these are people who have institutional knowledge, etc., etc., etc. There was no other case study explored, and I mean, I think what we need to be heard. That's the starting point. We need to be heard by executive leaders and boards and excos, and yeah. Right.
Does anybody want to comment?
I'll give it a go. I think that, the voice of the people practitioner, whether it's OD or HR, I mean, I agree it does need to be heard, but I think that we have a very important role to play in terms of claiming our place at the table and building the kinds of arguments and cases that get us and keep us at the table. So I don't think it does much good to kind of bemoan the potential relegation of HR and OD in organizations, but rather to introduce the idea that it might need to be fought for. And we can debate the merits of organizational culture, whether there's a culture that includes strong people elements, but we need to realize, what is within our control and what is without our control. The whole locus of control piece is super important for me to raise the profile of what I'm doing, because I believe it's important, and I can demonstrate through evidence that what I'm doing is important in the organization. And that's great. And if I can do that successfully, I'll stay in the organization. If there's no chance culturally for me to be able to do that, then maybe it's time to think about moving on to another organization. That's just my thought. Thank you.
Perhaps if I can also just make a comment, and I think that from a personal perspective and a personal viewpoint, if you are only working with the glamorous aspects of OD and only wanting to be in the major transformational and redesign space and so forth, then I think you set up a process where people see OD practitioners as these elitist type of resources. Some of the work that I've done in the past is actually really getting into the nitty-gritty of basic organizational efficiency. And if you open yourself up from a consulting perspective to actually really get down to that level, where you even start analyzing what is the problem in terms of flow from one department to another, by looking at something as simplistic as SOPs and saying, but your SOPs don't talk to each other. They've been written in isolation, excuse me, and then actually demonstrating the value that you can add to an organization by fixing rudimentary issues and actually lifting that up. So for me, the notion of what is an OD practitioner, what does an OD practitioner do? And I go back to the definition that was coined in Wald's view a number of years ago. And an OD practitioner creates organizational effectiveness and health. And if we only want to work in the health aspect side of things, we set ourselves up for failure. We have to get into the deep OD efficiency structures and processes as OD practitioners, because that's what gives us the credence, the ability, the seat at the table, the right to actually influence the organizational health. If we understand the organizational inefficiencies to the extent that the operational people do. So an OD person for me is a highly operational, highly technical, highly skilled individual that can work across any platform in an organization. And for me, that's part of what we miss. So sorry if I sound like I'm off on a bandwagon here, but for me, that's the key, is actually working right in the up to armpits in the detail in organizations. Sometimes that gives you the ability to work across the different platforms and add strategic value. So just a different view.
Eugene, and even if you don't get asked to come and work up to your armpits in the strategic detail or the efficiency and inefficiencies, I sometimes think it's the way we enter. If we ask to come and do leadership development, what is the underlying issue?
Yeah.
What are we trying to fix? And what would good look like? So that we agree on the metrics beforehand, because otherwise they might spend a few thousand or a few 100,000 rands with us. And afterwards you walk out and they're like, but nothing's really changed.
Correct.
And correct. Some stuff might have changed, but we never agreed to what do we want to change.
So I mean, I like to tell stories, Liesl, because it brings home some of the things that we do. So I work in an organization where I was asked to help with the leadership paradigm and shifting the leadership paradigm in the organization. What I discovered was an operational inefficiency in the business all the way from recruiting a call center agent right through to departing the call center agent because they're just not making it. Okay. Now, various things come into play there, and it's processes like ineffective recruitment practices, where they're recruiting the wrong type of person, ineffective promises that they make the agent that they bring into the business because they sketch to them a picture which is not reality on the other side of the fence. So they get a picture, they move to the other side of the fence, and they experience a different picture immediately. Then they start working in this environment, and they're managed in such a way that it's not safe, they don't feel comfortable, they're not allowed to express their opinions, they can't grow, and the immense churn that takes place in that organization causes huge financial costs in terms of this whole process. Now, it's very easy to go into the organization and say, I'm going to teach your people how to lead. That ain't going to fix the problem. So what I then eventually did is I sat down with the CEO and said, we have an operational inefficiency, which we've got to work through right from the word go and actually pull that through the entire organization. And for me, that's the OD work that needs to take place. Now, we're only halfway into that process at the moment, but already the churn that's starting to take place, or the churn that used to be there, is beginning to reduce, and people are beginning to feel more effective, to the extent that we've now even written down a leadership framework and a toolkit because people just don't know how to do it. So now every leader has got a toolkit, and they're now being measured in their KPIs in terms of how to show up differently. So that whole process, because you can do whatever you like in terms of changing it on the one side, if you don't start at the beginning of the chain and work it all the way through, you can't transform the organization. You can't create a new leadership paradigm. So for me, it's just it's a different way of looking at it. And I tend to think that as OD practitioners, we really have to look very deep into the systemic cause of issues. And that's where we have to start. So just it's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. And I agree with you 100%. And I think quite often the health and effectiveness balance is not gotten right. I mean, as you say, we've been preaching and evangelizing health and effectiveness. And if you don't get both, it's not OD. It's either just the soft people stuff, which is then called soft and fluffy and hard to understand, so we ignore it, or it just becomes effectiveness, and neither of those are. Eugene, years and years and years ago at one of our sales cafes, I think but you were definitely in the room. I can't remember if it's you or somebody else that told the story of a CEO who saw his people and actually used the metaphor of a bag of oranges, where you take an orange out, you cut it, and then you squeeze and you squeeze until there's nothing left, and you chuck it away, and then you just get a new bag of oranges when those orange, and it stuck with me. It was such a profound metaphor, this bag of oranges that they were squeezing out. And that, it's just effectiveness. I just want to check in. Deon, you unmuted yourself at a stage. Did you want to contribute? Do you want to comment?
I think a little bit unrelated, but I think one of the issues that I've seen is just that when I started in HR, granted many, many, many moons ago, there was a very strong foundation built for OD skills. And I do agree, somebody mentioned, well, actually, what is OD these days? Because in some cases, it's org development, and some it's org design, and then we've got org effectiveness in between. It's like change management. Ask 3 HR practitioners what it means, and you'll get 4 definitions. But I really think there's an opportunity for a community like this to really go back to building foundational skills, because in many organizations, my view is that HR has been reduced to delivering a calendar, recruiting people, salary increases, performance reviews, and getting all the documents. So I think there's a massive, we were kind of forced as young HR professionals to attend SEP Serfontein. And as grueling as it was just an amazing 2.5 weeks spent learning the fundamentals of OD, going out, thrown into a company to go and find somebody to work with. Yeah, I really think there's a big opportunity to build the skills. And that's why we are getting so many clients saying we've got to build, metric skills. We've got to build the OD skills, the strategic consulting skills. That in many cases, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. So I really think there's a massive opportunity. And I guess that's why so many people have been able to build, large consulting firms, small consulting firms, because it's just not in the fabric of HR anymore, in my view. Mm. And so the Old Mutuals and APSA was an amazing learning school. And somewhere, even Eskom and Transnet, and somewhere just got lost. Not sure how and when, but I don't think it's there anymore.
Mm. No. Christy, I see you violently nodding. Did you want to add anything?
No, that was just agreement. I can resonate with that. I think it's right. Yeah. It is true. There was a time when Eskom was sort of this leading light in the development of people. It was
sorry, did you say leading light? Was that a pun? Or?
Of course. Yeah, I think I do think there's a little bit of an identity crisis in organization development. There's a Alan Shabat, this thing is running after fads. The other one is the instrumentalization of, or the commoditization of organization development, where organization development is really a consulting role in the organization. Even if you're in the organization, you're a consultant. You're there to dig around and uncover stuff and help people think and do all of that stuff. And I think we get shoehorned into leadership development, for instance, as this sort of programmatic thing in the organization. It's necessary. And OD needs to think about what leadership needs to be developed. We get pulled in here at the bottom end when it's already been decided what leadership must be developed, and you must just develop it. And that's exactly wrong. But I liked the story you told, Deon, about how you covered your own internal forces and you sort of raised your courage and you said, here I am, and I want to know, and I want to understand. And I'm not leaving before I do. For me, if I take one thing out of today, it would be that. Thank you.
Thanks all. I've got to jump off for another call. It was good meeting everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here, Deon, and thanks for sharing.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Deon. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Don't give up. Keep going.
So what I want to end off with, that is my takeaway for today. Maybe it's because I'm a very optimistic, positive person. And it was sparked by what Nikki put in the chat to say we have to jump over and through and under the HR gatekeepers. But what I'm getting, what I'm thinking, what I'm hoping is if HR's agenda starts to really, really strategically include culture and becoming the custodian of leadership skills, and the things that OD is super interested in, would that not then take the gatekeeper role away? Would they then not maybe come to us for help? Because this is now part of their agenda. I'm wondering.
Making a comment here.
Okay, so we've got 3 or 4 minutes left. Does anybody have anything they want to add as a closing thought, or a heart today, or challenge my my positivity? before we close? Beatrice.
Thank you. I just want to say, for me, the whole issue around bias has just been such a fascinating reminder, and unconscious bias. And I just think about a number of times that I have experienced bias. I also, in the corporate environment, had an HR background, then moved into an OD background. And I mentioned earlier in the little comments section, the code of good practice around harassment that's just been released in relation to the Employment Equity Act. It's the code of good practice. It contains some fascinating stuff. And I think about the eye rolling and the sighing and the stuff that I was subject to and have continued to be subject to in my consulting role as well, because there is, conscious or unconscious, huge bias towards HR people in organizations. And until we manage to highlight that and put it on the table and kill it ourselves, we're not going to get very far. Because they just say, ho hum, here comes HR again, and it's the big switch off. I know, even recently, I've been part of strat sessions. You start talking the people agenda, and you can see people's eyes just glazing over. We've got to tackle that eye glazing, and we've got to call it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just sick of the eye rolling and the sighing that goes on when you put people issues on the table.
Sorry, just a comment then. That's why my research evidenced, and it was actually from my empirical research and from one of the banks, and I just did the 4 that are the traditional retail universal banks that have international footprint in South Africa, and they have legacy specifically, and that was why I chose them, not just because they're the most competitive or anything, but one of a bank had the leader, the executive CEO of the bank, had the courage and commitment to see that if he didn't give HR the absolute unconditional mandate to transform HR in the organization, and that meant having the mandate to have those crucial conflicted conversations with executive, middle, senior and middle managers, then it was never going to change. And that the HR practitioners and HR business partners would remain hamstrung and imprisoned in the boxes that they were put in by the managers who didn't know better and didn't want to know better. And absolutely. And I think sometimes we just need to be that person. We need to go to, we need to find an ally in the organization and go into their CEO's office. As Deon said, the PA to their CEO is one of his best friends. And that's what we need to do. Because there's too much of a boys club or whatever school club going on in these organizations. I know I'm maybe being a bit disrespectful, but it's the case.
Nikki, we're running out of time, so
enough. Okay.
But I hear you. Thank you, everybody. It's past, so thank you for being here. We'll just close off officially, and then those who want to hang around for another 5 or 10 minutes are welcome to do so. And I want to close with the thought that we've always said at Worldsview that OD needs to be Merlin to the king. OD needs to report into the CEO. So OD shouldn't actually need to be friends with the PA of the CEO. But yes, that's a good idea.
Oh, lovely.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having a great conversation with us. Have a beautiful day and hope to see you again next month.